There's a moment in your life that almost no one talks about. Not the moment you succeed, not the moment everything works out, but the moment everything quietly falls apart. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No one claps, no one notices. But inside, something breaks. Maybe it was the job you lost, the relationship that ended, the opportunity that slipped away just when you thought you were finally close. And in that moment, you don't just feel like you failed. You start to feel like you are a failure. That's where most people get stuck. Not because they're weak, not because they're incapable, but because they misunderstand what failure really is. I've seen this happen more times than I can count. People who are talented, driven, full of potential, slowly shrinking their own lives after one or two painful experiences. Not because life ended for them, but because something inside them quietly decided, don't go there again. Don't risk that again. Stay safe. And without realizing it, they didn't just avoid failure. They started avoiding growth. What's dangerous is that this doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like being realistic. It feels like protecting yourself. It feels like learning your limits. But in reality, it's the beginning of a life that slowly gets smaller. Here's the truth most people never realize. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the process that builds it, but only if you understand how to use it. Because failure does something very specific to you. It rewires how you see yourself. It reshapes what you believe you're capable of. And if you're not aware of it, it will quietly turn you into someone who stops trying, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, almost invisibly. And that's why some people go through failure and come out stronger, while others go through the same experience and never fully recover. Not because they're different, but because they responded differently to what failure was trying to teach them. At some point, I realized something that completely changed how I look at failure. Failure is not random. It's not punishment. It's not proof that you're not good enough. It's feedback, precise, consistent, uncomfortable, but incredibly valuable feedback. And once you start seeing it that way, everything changes. You stop running from failure. You stop taking it personally. And you start using it. That's when something powerful happens. You become harder to break. Not because life gets easier, but because you become someone who knows how to rebuild again and again and again. This is what resilience really is. Not toughness, not pretending nothing affects you, but the ability to take what should have destroyed you and use it to become something stronger. In this audiobook, we're going to break that process down, step by step. You'll understand why your mind reacts the way it does after failure, why you keep repeating certain patterns without realizing it, and most importantly, how to turn every failure in your life into something that builds you instead of breaking you. Because at some point, failure stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that works for you. And when that shift happens, you don't just recover anymore. You become unstoppable. Chapter 1. The failure you still don't understand. There's a moment that changes people more than success ever could, but most people don't recognize it when it happens. It usually starts quietly, not with a big collapse, not with everything falling apart at once, but with something small that doesn't go the way you expected. Maybe you applied for something you really wanted and didn't get it. Maybe you gave your time, your effort, your energy into something and it didn't work. Maybe you trusted someone and it ended in a way you didn't see coming. And at first, you tell yourself it's fine. It's just one setback. It's not a big deal. I'll try again. But something shifts. Not outside, inside. Because failure doesn't just happen to your life. It happens to your perception of yourself. I remember a story about a guy who had been working toward one goal for years. He did everything right. He prepared. He stayed disciplined. He showed up even when it was hard, and when the moment finally came, he failed. Not dramatically, just enough to miss the outcome he had built everything around. From the outside, nothing really changed. He was still capable, still intelligent, still had the same opportunities in front of him. But internally, everything was different. Because now there was a question that hadn't existed before. What if I'm not who I thought I was? And that question is where failure becomes dangerous. Not because of the event itself, but because of what it makes you believe. This is the part no one teaches you. Failure doesn't break your life. It rewrites your identity. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. So you don't wake up one day and decide to play smaller. You don't consciously choose to avoid risk. You don't say, I'm going to limit myself now. Instead, you hesitate a little more. You overthink a little longer. You doubt yourself a little faster. And over time, those small shifts become patterns. Patterns become habits, and habits become the life you live. That's how people go from being ambitious to being careful, from being confident to being uncertain, from chasing something meaningful to settling for something safe. Not because they lost their ability, but because failure changed how they see themselves. And once your identity shifts, your behavior follows. This is why two people can go through the exact same failure and end up in completely different places. One person uses it as fuel. They analyze it. They learn from it. And soon they come back sharper. The other person carries it like weight. They replay it. They internalize it. They start avoiding situations where it might happen again. Same event, different interpretation, different future. That's when I started realizing something most people miss. Failure is not the problem. Misinterpreting failure is. Because failure by itself is neutral. It doesn't mean you're not good enough. It doesn't mean you're not capable. It doesn't mean you should stop. But your mind doesn't treat it that way. Your mind is designed to protect you. And from your brain's perspective, failure equals pain. So what does it do? It tries to prevent you from experiencing that pain again. Not by making you stronger, but by making you more cautious, more hesitant, more controlled. And in doing that, it quietly pulls you away from growth. So this is where most people get trapped. Not in failure itself, but in the avoidance of it. Because avoiding failure feels smart. It feels responsible. It feels like you're learning. But what you're actually doing is shrinking your life to fit your comfort. And the more you do that, the smaller your world becomes. Until one day you look around and realize you're not really failing anymore. But you're not really growing either. That's the trade-off most people make without realizing it. They give up the possibility of failure, and in exchange, they give up the possibility of becoming more. But here's the shift that changes everything. Failure is not something you should avoid. It's something you should understand. Because every failure contains information, precise information, about what didn't work, about what needs to change, about where you're still limited. But if you take it personally, you never access that information. You only feel the pain, and pain without understanding leads to fear. Fear leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to a life that never fully expands. This is why some people seem unstoppable, not because they don't fail, but because they don't interpret failure the same way. They don't see it as a verdict. They see it as feedback, and feedback is something you can use. That's the difference. One mindset says, I failed, so maybe I'm not good enough. The other says, I failed, so there's something here I need to understand. That single shift changes everything, because one leads to limitation, the other leads to growth. And once you start seeing failure that way, you stop fearing it, you stop avoiding it, you stop letting it define you. Instead, you start using it. That's when failure stops being something that holds you back and becomes something that pushes you forward. But to get there, you have to understand something even deeper, because the real reason you struggle after failure is not what happened. It's how your mind is wired to respond to it. And that's exactly what we're going to uncover next. Chapter 2. Why your brain traps you after failure. There's something about failure that feels heavier than it should. Not just the event itself, but what happens after. The silence, the hesitation, the strange resistance to trying again. And if you've ever felt that, you probably asked yourself a question like this. Why is this so hard to move on from? Because logically, it doesn't make sense. You know one failure doesn't define you. You know you still have the ability. You know you could try again. And yet, something inside you holds back. That hesitation is not weakness, it's programming. Your brain is not designed to make you successful. It's designed to keep you safe. And from your brain's perspective, failure is a threat, not to your survival in a physical sense, but to your emotional stability, to your sense of identity, or to your sense of control, to your sense of certainty. So when you experience failure, your brain immediately starts doing one thing, trying to make sure it doesn't happen again. At first, that sounds helpful. But here's where it becomes a trap. Because your brain doesn't prevent failure by making you better. It prevents failure by making you smaller. Let me show you what that looks like. Imagine someone who puts themselves out there. They take a risk. They go after something meaningful, and it doesn't work out. At that moment, their brain registers something very simple. Doing this equals pain. So the next time they're in a similar situation, they don't feel excitement. They feel resistance. Not because they've lost their ambition, but because their brain is trying to protect them. And this protection shows up in subtle ways. One, you start overthinking more. You hesitate before taking action. You look for reasons why now is not the right time. You convince yourself to wait just a little longer, and every time you do that, your brain reinforces the same pattern. Avoid to stay safe to feel relief. That relief is important because it tricks you. It makes avoidance feel like the right decision, like you're being smart, like you're learning from your experience. But in reality, you're training yourself to avoid growth. This is what most people don't understand. Your brain doesn't reward courage. It rewards safety, even if that safety keeps you stuck. There's a concept psychologists often talk about: familiar pain versus unfamiliar growth. Familiar pain is what you already know. Disappointment, rejection, failure. It hurts, but it's predictable. Unfamiliar growth is different. It's uncertain. It's uncomfortable. It requires you to step into the unknown. And your brain hates that. So what does it do? It pulls you back toward what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is painful. That's why people stay in situations that don't serve them. That's why people repeat the same patterns. That's why people say they want change, but keep choosing the same outcomes, because the brain is not asking, what will make me better? It's asking, what will keep me safe? And safety often looks like staying exactly where you are. I once heard a story about someone who had a real opportunity to change their life. It was everything they had said they wanted. Growth, challenge, a chance to become more. But they hesitated. They told themselves, I'm not ready yet. Maybe later. What if it doesn't work out? And eventually, they didn't take it. Not because they didn't want it, but because the fear of failing again felt stronger than the desire to grow. And that's the invisible trap. You think you're making a rational decision, but you're actually responding to a past experience. You're not seeing the opportunity clearly. You're seeing it through the lens of your last failure. That's how failure controls you. Not by stopping you directly, but by shaping how you perceive risk. And once your perception changes, your behavior follows. You don't go all in anymore. You play it safe. You choose what you're sure you can handle. You avoid what might challenge you. And slowly, you build a life that protects you from failure, but also protects you from growth. That's the trade most people make. Without even realizing it, they think they're moving forward, but they're actually just moving within a smaller and smaller space. And the worst part is, it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like logic. It feels like maturity. It feels like you're finally being realistic. But being realistic is often just fear in disguise. Because if you were truly being logical, you would see that avoiding failure doesn't lead to success. It leads to stagnation. So the question is not, how do I stop failing? The real question is, how do I stop letting failure control my decisions? Because the moment you understand that your brain is wired this way, you gain something powerful. Awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer inside it. You start noticing when you hesitate, when you overthink, when you pull back, and instead of blindly following that reaction, you can pause, you can question it, you can choose differently. That's where resilience begins. Not in the absence of fear, but in your ability to act despite it. But to truly break this pattern, you need to understand something even deeper. Because failure doesn't just affect how you act. It affects who you believe you are. And that identity is what keeps you repeating the same cycle over and over again. That's what we're going to uncover next. Chapter 3. The identity failure quietly creates. There's something more dangerous than failure itself. Something most people never notice, but it shapes everything that comes after. It's not what happened. It's who you believe you are because of it. Failure doesn't just create pain, it creates identity. And identity is powerful, because once you believe something about yourself, you start acting in alignment with it. Not consciously, but automatically. I once knew someone who was incredibly talented. Sharp, focused, driven. The kind of person who, from the outside, looked like they were going to go far, and for a while, they did. They took risks. They stepped into uncomfortable situations. They pushed themselves. At first, these are just thoughts, but over time, they become beliefs, and beliefs shape behavior. You start holding back. You stop taking certain risks. You avoid situations where you might prove yourself wrong, not because you want to fail, but because you don't want to challenge the identity you've built. This is why people stay stuck for years, not because they don't have opportunities, but because their identity won't allow them to see themselves differently. Here's the part that's hard to accept. Most of your limitations are not real. They're constructed, built from past experiences, and reinforced by the meaning you gave those experiences. Failure didn't tell you who you are. You decided that, and once you decided, you started living it. That's why two people can fail in the same situation and walk away with completely different identities. One person says, "That didn't work. I need to improve." The other says, "That didn't work. Maybe I'm not good enough." Same event. So different identity, different future. And here's what makes identity so powerful. It filters everything. What you notice, what you ignore, what you believe is possible. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you'll notice every mistake, every flaw, every reason why things won't work. If you see yourself as someone who adapts, you'll notice opportunities, lessons, ways to adjust. That's why identity is not just a reflection of your past. It's a blueprint for your future. And failure, if you're not careful, quietly rewrites that blueprint without you even realizing it. You don't wake up and say, "I'm going to limit myself today." It happens subtly, through repetition, through internal dialogue, through the meaning you assign to what happened. And over time, you become someone who lives inside that story. That's the invisible prison. Not failure itself, but the identity it creates. The most dangerous part, it feels comfortable, because once you define yourself in a certain way, you no longer have to face uncertainty. You don't have to risk being wrong again. You don't have to step into situations where you might fail. You stay within what feels like you, even if that version of you is smaller than what you could become. That's the trade. Certainty, in exchange for growth. And most people make that trade without realizing it. But here's the shift that changes everything. Identity is not fixed. It's constructed. And anything that is constructed can be reconstructed. The person you think you are right now is not permanent. It's just the result of patterns. Patterns of thought, patterns of behavior, patterns of interpretation. And if those patterns created your current identity, new patterns can create a different one. That's where resilience starts to take a deeper form. Not just in how you respond to failure, but in how you redefine yourself after it. Instead of asking, "What does this say about me?" you start asking, "What does this require me to become?" That question changes everything, because now, failure is no longer a label. It's a direction. It's showing you where you need to grow, where you need to adapt, where you need to expand beyond your current limits. And when you start seeing it that way, you stop protecting your identity and you start evolving it. That's when the cycle breaks, because you're no longer trying to prove who you are. You're focused on becoming who you need to be. But even with that shift, there's still something most people miss. Because knowing that failure creates identity is not enough. You also need to understand the patterns hidden inside failure itself. Because if you don't see those patterns, you will keep repeating the same outcomes, no matter how much you try to change. And that's exactly what we're going to uncover next. Chapter 4. The Lessons Hidden Inside. Every failure. Most people go through failure, but very few actually learn from it. Not because they're incapable, but because they're looking at the wrong thing. When something goes wrong, your mind immediately reacts. It looks for someone to blame. It looks for a reason to explain the discomfort. It looks for a way to move on as quickly as possible. And in doing that, it skips the most important part. Understanding. Because failure is not just an experience. It's information. Precise information. About what didn't work. About what you didn't see. About what you weren't ready for yet. But most people never access that information because they turn failure into something emotional instead of something useful. Let me show you what that looks like. Two people go through the same situation, and they both try something. They both fail. One of them walks away thinking, "That was a waste of time." The other walks away asking, "What exactly happened there?" That single difference creates two completely different futures Because one person is trying to escape the feeling. The other is trying to understand the pattern, and patterns are everything. Failure is rarely random. It follows structure. There are signals before it happens. There are decisions that lead to it. There are blind spots that make it inevitable. But if you don't slow down, you never see any of that. You just feel the impact, and then you move on, only to experience something similar again. That's why people say, "I don't know why this keeps happening to me." It's not that you don't know, it's that you never stopped long enough to see. And because seeing requires discomfort, it requires you to look at what you missed, where you misjudged, where you avoided something you should have faced. And that's not easy. So instead, the mind chooses a simpler path. Blame something external, or dismiss it entirely, or tell yourself it just wasn't meant to be. But when you do that, you lose the lesson. And when you lose the lesson, you repeat the experience. That's the loop most people live in. Failure to emotion, to escape to repeat, over and over again. Not because life is against them, but because they never extracted what failure was trying to show them. Here's the shift that changes everything. Failure is data, not drama. It's not there to hurt you, it's there to inform you. But you can only access that information if you separate the event from your emotions. That doesn't mean ignoring how you feel. It means not letting your feelings distort what actually happened. Because emotions are immediate, but understanding takes time. And most people never give themselves that time. They rush to feel better, instead of trying to see clearly. But clarity is where growth comes from, not from avoiding discomfort, but from analyzing it. Let me give you a simple example. Someone tries something new. It doesn't work. They immediately think, "I'm not good at this." That's an emotional conclusion. It feels true, but it's not precise. A better question would be, what part of this didn't work? Was it the strategy, the timing, the preparation, the execution? Now you're working with data, and data gives you options. Because if something didn't work, it means something can be adjusted. But if you label yourself as the problem, there's nothing to adjust. You just stay stuck. That's why the way you interpret failure matters more than the failure itself. Because interpretation determines whether you grow or repeat. And the difference between those two paths is often just one question. Not, "Why did this happen to me?" but, "What is this trying to show me?" That question slows everything down. It shifts you out of reaction and into observation. And observation is where awareness begins. You start noticing patterns, the same type of decisions, the same type of reactions, the same type of outcomes. And once you see the pattern, you can change it. But until you see it, you're inside it. This is where most people get frustrated. They feel like they're trying. They feel like they're putting in effort. But nothing changes. Because effort without awareness just reinforces the same pattern. You can work harder and still end up in the same place if you're not adjusting what matters. That's why high performers don't just move on from failure. They study it, not emotionally, but strategically. They ask, "What did I miss? What assumption was wrong? What needs to change next time?" They don't take failure personally. They take it seriously, and that difference is everything, because when you take something personally, you protect your ego. But when you take something seriously, you improve your approach. And improvement is what leads to growth. Not intention, not effort alone, but adjustment. That's what failure is for, to show you what needs to change. But if you never look for that, you stay exactly where you are. Or worse, you move forward thinking you've learned. when you've actually just repeated the same mistake in a different form. That's the illusion of progress, and it keeps people stuck for years. Doing more, trying harder, but never getting different results, because they never change the pattern. So the real skill is not avoiding failure, it's extracting value from it, every single time. No exceptions, because every failure has something inside it. A signal, a correction, a direction, but only if you're willing to look, only if you're willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand it. That's where growth begins. Not when things go right, but when you finally start seeing clearly when they don't. And once you develop that ability, failure stops being something that confuses you. It becomes something that guides you. But even with that awareness, there's still one more shift you need to make. Because understanding failure is one thing, but turning it into power is something completely different. And that's exactly what we're going to step into next. Chapter 5. Turning failure into power. Understanding failure is one thing. Using it is something completely different. Because most people, even when they start to see the patterns, still don't know what to do with them. They understand what went wrong, but they don't transform that understanding into change. And that's the gap between awareness and growth. Because awareness, by itself, doesn't change your life. It only shows you what needs to change. Power comes from what you do with that awareness. This is where high performers separate themselves from everyone else. Not in how they avoid failure, but in how they respond to it. Most people experience failure and ask, why did this happen? High performers experience failure and ask something different. How can I use this? That question changes everything, because now, failure is no longer something that happened to you. It becomes something you can work with, something you can shape, something you can turn into an advantage. But to do that, you have to stop seeing failure as something negative and start seeing it as something neutral, even useful. That's not easy, because emotionally, failure doesn't feel neutral. It feels heavy, it feels personal, it feels like something you want to avoid. But if you stay in that emotional state, you never access its value. You just carry its weight. Let me give you a simple shift. Instead of asking, what went wrong? Ask, what did this reveal? Because failure reveals things success often hides. It shows you where you're not as strong as you thought, where your assumptions were off, where your preparation wasn't enough. And that's not a weakness, that's clarity. And clarity is power, because once you see clearly, you can adjust precisely. That's how growth actually works. Not by doing more, but by doing differently. This is where most people get it wrong. They think improvement comes from effort. So after failure, they push harder. They try again with more intensity, more energy, more pressure. But if you're repeating the same pattern, more effort just leads to more frustration. Because the problem was never how hard you tried, it was how you approached it. That's why the real question after failure is not, how do I try harder? It's, what needs to change? That question forces you to look deeper, to examine your assumptions, your decisions, your blind spots. And once you do that, you stop reacting to failure and start learning from it. This is the moment failure begins to transform. From something painful into something powerful. I once heard about someone who failed multiple times in a row. Same type of situation, same type of outcome, and for a while they thought they were just unlucky, that something external was holding them back. But eventually, they stopped blaming the situation and started analyzing their pattern. they realized something subtle, but important. It wasn't what they were doing. It was how they were thinking, the assumptions they were making, the way they were approaching decisions. Once they saw that, everything changed. Not instantly, but directionally. Because now, they weren't just trying again. They were trying differently. And that's the key. Failure only becomes power when it leads to adjustment. Not repetition, not avoidance, but intentional change. That's why high performers don't fear failure. They rely on it. Because it gives them feedback they can't get any other way. It shows them exactly where to improve, exactly what to refine, exactly what to upgrade. And over time, that creates an edge. While others are avoiding failure, they are learning from it. While others are stuck in the same patterns, they are evolving. That's how people become unstoppable. Not by avoiding mistakes, but by reducing how long they stay the same after making them. That's the real metric. Not how often you fail, but how quickly you learn, how quickly you adjust, how quickly you move forward with more clarity than before. Because if every failure teaches you something, then every failure moves you forward. And if that keeps happening, you don't stay stuck for long. You keep progressing. Even when things don't go your way. That's power, not control over outcomes, but control over your response. And once you have that, failure loses its ability to hold you back. Because no matter what happens, you know you'll extract something from it. You know you'll use it. You know it won't be wasted. That mindset changes how you approach everything. You take more risks. You step into uncertainty more willingly. You stop waiting for perfect conditions because you're no longer trying to avoid failure. You're ready to use it. And that's where growth accelerates, because the biggest limitation most people have is not their ability. It's their hesitation. And hesitation disappears when failure is no longer something you fear, but something you trust, not because it feels good, but because you know it works in your favor. That's the shift, from reacting to using, from avoiding to engaging, from being controlled by failure to controlling how you respond to it. But to make this consistent, to make it automatic, you need more than just a mindset. You need a system, something you can rely on. Even when emotions are high, even when things don't go your way, even when you feel like pulling back. And that's exactly what we're going to build next. A blueprint, a structure, a way to turn resilience into something you can actually practice, not just understand. And once you have that, everything changes. Chapter 6. The Blueprint for Resilience. There's a moment in every person's life when everything they thought was stable begins to fall apart. Not all at once, but enough to make them question everything, who they are, what they're doing, where they're going. And in that moment, resilience doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like confusion, like standing in the middle of something you don't understand, with no clear way forward. I once heard about someone who reached that exact point. From the outside, their life looked fine. They had direction, they had plans. They were building something. But internally, things were starting to crack. The certainty they once had slowly disappeared. And then, but almost all at once, everything collapsed. Not just one part of their life. Multiple. Career, relationships, confidence, gone. And what replaced it wasn't motivation. It wasn't clarity. It was silence. And one quiet question. Now what? That's where most people break. Not because they're weak, but because they don't have anything to fall back on. They try to rely on motivation, but motivation disappears when things get hard. They try to stay positive, but positivity fades when reality hits. They try to push forward, but without direction, That effort goes nowhere, and eventually they fall back into old patterns. That's why resilience is not about how you feel. It's about what you do when you don't feel strong at all. It's about having something you can rely on when everything inside you wants to stop. After failure, the mind becomes loud. It starts telling stories. It exaggerates what went wrong. It makes things personal. It turns one moment into a definition of who you are. That's where everything starts to distort. So the first shift is simple, but uncomfortable. You have to see what actually happened. Not the story, not the emotion, just the reality. What decisions were made, what actions were taken, what led to the outcome, because without clarity, you're not rebuilding, you're reacting, and reaction keeps you stuck. Then comes something even harder, separating yourself from what happened. Because failure has a way of becoming personal. You don't just think, that didn't work. You start thinking, something is wrong with me. And once that happens, everything feels heavier. Every mistake feels like proof. Every setback feels like confirmation. So you need to create distance, not from responsibility, but from identity. You are not your last outcome. You are not your worst moment. You are someone going through a process, and processes include failure. That shift alone changes how you carry the experience. Because now you're not defending who you are. You're improving how you operate. And once you create that space, you can finally look at failure differently. Because meaning is everything. If failure means you're not good enough, you pull back. If failure means there's something to learn, you lean in. Same experience, completely different response. So instead of asking what went wrong in a way that makes you feel worse, you start asking in a way that moves you forward. What did this reveal? What pattern is showing up? What needs to change? Now failure is no longer something emotional. It becomes something useful. And when that happens, you stop avoiding it. You start working with it. But understanding alone doesn't change anything. At some point, you have to move. Not in the same way, not with the same approach, but with adjustment. That's where most people fall back. They either freeze and do nothing, or they repeat the same behavior, hoping for a different result. Both lead to the same place. No real change. So the difference is not action itself. It's intentional action. Action based on what you've learned. More precise. More aware. More aligned. And every time you do that, something starts to build. Not just results, confidence. But not the kind of confidence that comes from things going right. The kind that comes from knowing you can handle things when they don't. Because now you've seen it. You've gone through it, and you didn't collapse. You adjusted. You moved forward. That's where resilience begins to take shape. Not as an idea, but as something real, something you've experienced, something you can trust. And over time, this process becomes something you rely on. You don't panic when things go wrong. You don't avoid challenges. You don't need everything to be perfect, because you know you have a way to handle it. That's what changes everything. You stop needing control over outcomes, and you start focusing on control over your response. And that's where real stability comes from, because outcomes are unpredictable. But your response doesn't have to be. And once you build that, failure stops being something that threatens you. It becomes something that shapes you. You don't try to avoid it anymore. You don't take it personally. You use it again and again until something shifts. You realize you're no longer fragile. You don't break the way you used to. You don't hesitate the same way. You don't carry failure as something heavy. You carry it as something useful. That's when resilience becomes part of you. Not something you think about, but something you live. And once you reach that point, there's a quiet confidence that starts to appear. Not loud, not obvious, but steady. Because deep down, you know something most people don't. No matter what happens, you'll figure it out. You'll adjust. You'll rebuild. And that's what makes you dangerous in the best possible way. Not because you can't fail, but because failure can't stop you anymore. But even with that, there's still one more step. Because understanding the process is not enough. You have to train it until it becomes automatic, until it becomes your default. And that's what we're stepping into next. Chapter 7. Training yourself to become unstoppable. Understanding something is easy. Living it is something else entirely. Because in calm moments, everything makes sense. You know what you should do. You understand the patterns. You see things clearly. But when pressure hits, when things don't go your way again, when emotions come back, that clarity disappears, and you fall back into what's familiar, not what's right, but what's automatic. That's the difference between knowing and becoming. Because you don't rise to your intentions, you fall back to your conditioning. And if your conditioning is built on fear, hesitation, and avoidance, that's exactly where you'll go. No matter how much you understand. That's why resilience has to be trained. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently, until it becomes your default response. Because when something becomes your default, you don't have to think about it. You just do it. Let me show you what that looks like. After failure, there's always a moment, a small window, where your mind reacts. It tells you to pull back, to avoid, to protect yourself. That moment is where everything is decided. Not the failure itself, but your response to it. Most people don't notice that moment. They just follow the reaction. They hesitate. They overthink. They delay. By the time they realize it, they're already back in the same pattern. But if you train yourself to notice that moment, everything changes. Because now you have a choice. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause, even if it's just for a second. That pause creates space. And in that space, you can observe what's happening. You can see the fear, the doubt, the impulse to avoid, without immediately acting on it. That's the first habit. Not reacting instantly, just noticing. Because awareness breaks automatic behavior. Then comes the second part. You question what you're feeling, not in a way that judges it, but in a way that understands it. Is this fear helping me or limiting me? Am I avoiding this because it's wrong or because it's uncomfortable? That question is powerful because it separates truth from emotion, and once you see that clearly, you can make a different decision, not based on fear, but based on growth. That's the shift. From emotional reaction to intentional action. At first, it feels unnatural. It feels forced. Because you're going against your default pattern. But that's exactly how change happens. You don't wait to feel different. You act differently first. See, and over time, that action rewires how you respond. This is how you build a new loop. Instead of failure to fear to avoidance. You create failure to awareness to adjustment to action, and the more you repeat that, the stronger it becomes. At some point, you stop needing to remind yourself. You stop needing to force it. You just respond differently. That's when resilience becomes real. Not because you don't feel fear, but because fear no longer controls your behavior. I once heard about someone who used to hesitate every time something didn't go their way. They would overthink. They would delay. They would wait until they felt ready. Most of the time, that moment never came. Until they decided to change one thing, not everything, just one thing. They stopped waiting for confidence and started acting with awareness, even when they didn't feel ready, even when it felt uncomfortable. And at first, it was messy. It didn't feel natural. But over time, something shifted. They didn't hesitate as long. They didn't overthink as much. They started trusting their ability to figure things out, instead of waiting to feel certain. That's how transformation actually happens. Not in one big moment, but in small, repeated decisions. Because every time you choose growth over comfort, you reinforce a new identity. You become someone who acts, someone who adapts, someone who moves forward, even when it's uncomfortable. And that identity changes everything, because now, when failure happens, you don't collapse. You respond. You don't avoid. You engage. You don't question whether you're capable. You focus on what needs to change. That's what makes someone unstoppable. Not perfection, not constant success, but consistency in how they respond, no matter what happens. And once you build that, something interesting happens. Failure loses its emotional weight. It doesn't feel as heavy. It doesn't feel as personal. It becomes part of the process. Something expected. Something useful. And because of that, you stop fearing it. You stop trying to avoid it. You start moving faster, taking more risks, stepping into things you used to hesitate on, not because you're reckless, but because you trust your ability to handle whatever happens. That's real confidence, not the belief that everything will go right, but the certainty that you'll be fine even when it doesn't. And that kind of confidence can't be taken away, because it's built through experience, through repetition, through proving to yourself, again and again, that you can adapt, that you can learn, that you can move forward, no matter what. That's what makes you different, because while most people are still trying to avoid failure, you've learned how to use it, and that gives you an edge, not just in results, but in how you approach life. You're no longer waiting. You're no longer hesitating. You're no longer holding yourself back. You're moving, adjusting, growing, constantly. And that's when you realize something. You're not the same person anymore. The things that used to stop you don't have the same power. The fear that used to control you feels smaller. The hesitation that used to slow you down fades faster, because you've trained yourself to respond differently. And once that becomes your default, there's only one direction left. Forward. But there's still one final shift, because becoming unstoppable is not just about how you act, it's about who you become. And that's what we're stepping into next. Chapter 8. Becoming someone who cannot be broken. At some point, something shifts. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. And from the outside, it doesn't look like much has changed. But inside, everything is different. You don't react the same way anymore. The things that used to shake you don't hit as hard. The situations that used to make you hesitate don't stop you the same way. It's subtle, but it's real. And if you pay attention, you realize something you've never felt before. You're not afraid of failure in the same way. Not because failure disappeared, but because your relationship with it changed. There was a time when failure felt like a wall, something that blocked you, something that defined you, something that made you question everything. But now, it feels different. It feels like part of the path, something expected, something useful, something that no longer has the power to stop you. That's when you know something has changed, not in your circumstances, but in you. Because becoming unstoppable doesn't mean nothing goes wrong. It doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. It means something deeper. It means you've become someone who no longer breaks the same way, and that changes everything. I remember hearing about someone who used to struggle every time things didn't go their way. They would overthink everything, replay every mistake, question every decision, doubt themselves constantly. Failure wasn't just an event. It was something they carried, something that stayed with them, shaped how they saw themselves, controlled how they acted. But over time, something shifted. Not because their life became perfect, but because they stopped reacting the same way. They stopped taking failure personally. They stopped turning every setback into a story about who they were. Instead, they started seeing it as part of the process. Something to understand, something to adjust, something to use. And that one shift changed everything, because now, when things didn't go their way, they didn't collapse. They didn't spiral. They didn't disappear. They paused, they looked at what happened, they adjusted, and they moved forward, again and again and again. And that repetition created something powerful, not just results, but identity. They became someone who adapts, someone who learns, someone who keeps moving, no matter what. And that identity is different, because it doesn't depend on outcomes. It doesn't depend on things going right. It's stable. Look, it's internal. It's something you carry with you, into every situation. That's what makes someone hard to break. Not strength in the traditional sense. Not toughness, but understand something most people don't. There is no perfect moment. There is only the moment you decide to move. And once you move, you figure the rest out along the way. That's how growth actually happens. Not before action, but through it. And when you trust that process, you stop holding yourself back. You stop overanalyzing. You stop trying to control everything. You allow things to unfold, and you respond as they do. That's where freedom begins. Not freedom from failure, but freedom from being controlled by it. Because most people live their lives trying to avoid pain, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to avoid discomfort, and in doing that, they limit themselves. They stay in what feels safe, what feels familiar, what feels predictable. But safety has a cost. It keeps you from growing. It keeps you from expanding. It keeps you from becoming more than what you are right now. And most people accept that trade without even realizing it. They choose certainty over possibility. But when you reach this point, you stop making that trade because you've experienced something different. You've seen what happens when you face failure, when you learn from it, when you use it. You've seen how it builds you, not instantly, but over time. And that changes your perspective. You no longer see failure as something negative. You see it as part of the process of becoming. And that process never really ends, because there's always another level, another challenge, another situation that will test you. But now, you don't see that as a threat. You see it as an opportunity, a chance to grow again, a chance to expand again, a chance to become something more. That's the mindset that keeps you moving forward, not because you're chasing something external, but because you've become someone who evolves, continuously, relentlessly. And once you step into that, there's a quiet confidence that starts to build. Not loud, not something you need to prove, but something steady, something grounded. Because you know something most people don't. No matter what happens, you'll be okay. Not because things will go your way, but because you know how to respond when they don't. You know how to adjust. You know how to rebuild. You know how to move forward. And that knowledge changes how you carry yourself. You don't rush. You don't panic. You don't react the same way. You stay grounded, even when things are uncertain, even when things don't go as planned, because you've been there before and you've come through it. That's where real strength comes from, not from avoiding difficulty, but from experiencing it and realizing it didn't break you. It built you. And once you truly understand that, you stop fearing the process. You start trusting it. Because every setback becomes something useful. Every mistake becomes something valuable. Every failure becomes something that moves you forward. And at that point, you're no longer trying to become unstoppable. You already are. Not because nothing can touch you, but because nothing can stop you from continuing, from learning, from adapting, from growing. And that's what separates you. Not talent, not luck, not perfect conditions, but your ability to keep going, to keep adjusting, to keep evolving, no matter what, because in the end, that's what this is really about. Not avoiding failure, not chasing success, but becoming someone who cannot be broken by either. Someone who doesn't rely on outcomes to feel stable. Someone who doesn't collapse when things don't go their way. Someone who keeps moving forward, with clarity, with awareness, with intention. And once you become that person, there's nothing left holding you back. Because the only thing that ever did was how you responded to what happened. And now, you've changed that. Forever. At the beginning, failure feels like something that happens to you. Something unexpected. Something unwanted. Something you wish you could avoid. It feels like a disruption, like something that interrupts your path. Something that pulls you away from where you are trying to go. And for a long time, that's how most people live. Trying to avoid it. Trying to control it. Trying to minimize it as much as possible. But somewhere along the way, if you've really understood what we've explored together, something begins to change. You stop seeing failure as the enemy. You stop treating it like something that shouldn't exist in your life, and you start seeing it differently. Not as a problem, but as part of the process, because every chapter you've just gone through points to the same truth. Failure was never the thing holding you back. It was how you responded to it, the meaning you gave it, the identity you built around it, the patterns you repeated because of it. That's what shaped your path, not the event itself. And once you see that clearly, there's a kind of freedom that comes with it. A quiet, grounded kind of freedom. Because now, you're no longer trying to eliminate failure from your life. You're no longer waiting for a moment where everything finally goes right. You understand something deeper. Growth doesn't happen when things are easy. It happens when things challenge you, when things stretch you, when things force you to see what you couldn't see before. And failure is often the thing that does that most effectively, not because it feels good, but because it reveals the truth about your patterns, your assumptions, your limitations. And once you see those things, you have a choice. You can ignore them, or you can use them. That's the shift. From avoiding to engaging, from reacting to understanding, from being controlled to becoming someone who chooses how to respond. And that shift is what changes everything. Because it doesn't just affect one area of your life. It affects how you approach everything. Challenges don't feel the same anymore. Uncertainty doesn't feel as threatening. Mistakes don't carry the same weight because you've experienced something different. You've seen that you can go through something difficult and come out stronger. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently. And that consistency builds something powerful. Trust, not trust in outcomes, but trust in yourself, in your ability to handle things, to adapt, to learn, to move forward, no matter what happens. And once you have that, you stop needing everything to be certain. You stop waiting for the perfect time. You stop holding yourself back. Because you're no longer relying on things going right. You're relying on your ability to respond when they don't. That's where confidence becomes real. Not something you say, Not something you try to convince yourself of, but something you've experienced enough times that it becomes part of who you are. And that's the point of everything you've just listened to. Not to avoid failure, not to become perfect, but to become someone who is not stopped by it. Someone who doesn't collapse when things go wrong. Someone who doesn't shrink their life to stay comfortable, but someone who continues to move forward, to grow, to evolve. Again and again. Because in the end, this isn't about one failure, or one moment, or one situation. It's about the pattern you live in. And once you change that pattern, everything else starts to change with it. The way you think, the way you act, the way you see yourself. And over time, that creates a different life. Not because you forced it, but because you became someone who operates differently. Someone who learns. Someone who adapts. Someone who doesn't stop. So if there's one thing to take from all of this, let it be this. Failure is not the thing that defines you. Your response to it is, and that response is something you can change. Starting now, in the smallest decisions, in the moments where you would normally hesitate, in the situations where you would normally pull back. That's where it begins, not in a big transformation, but in small shifts, repeated over time, until they become who you are. And when that happens, you don't just recover from failure anymore. You grow because of it. And eventually, you reach a point where nothing that happens has the power to stop you from continuing, from learning, from becoming more. And that's when you realize something simple, but powerful. You were never meant to avoid failure. You were meant to become someone who can use it. And once you do, there's nothing left holding you back. Just the path ahead, and the person you're becoming as you walk it.